Thank you. We're back again with peace, knowledge, and wisdom. Today we have Alyssa McIntyre here with us to share with us in the Black experience in America. And what we've been doing is talking about a lot of things of local interest, some of the things that's happened in the past leading up to now, with this being Black History Month and just past Martin Luther King's birthday. This time of year, we're always focused a little bit more than normal on Black history. One of the things that has been a need in our Black community that needed to be addressed was Black education. And today we're here with Alyssa, who is in the classroom serving our Black youth. And so I'm going to delve into her mind a little bit about what it's like being in the classroom and ask her some pointed questions about the education in America as it relates to our Black youth. Before we get started, I want to remind you to hit the subscribe button. Also hit the bell so that you're notified anytime we upload one of these videos. And then you hit the like button. If you like what Alyssa says, what I say, hit that like button. If you don't like it, go ahead and hit the down button, the dislike button, because we welcome all views. The one thing about this show, Alyssa, that I told everyone about is that everybody in the Black community has a viewpoint. And everybody understands things from their perspective. And there's a lot of things going on in the Black community now. The things that's going on with Oprah and Gayle King as it relates to Kobe Bryant, his passing. The thing with Jay-Z calling Kaepernick the NFL. The whole Black community isn't necessarily think the same way, and we all have different points of view. And so what I do with these interviews is I try to get everybody's point of view. Nobody's wrong, nobody's right. It's just that this is us, and we need to look for solutions. And in this case, we need to get some solutions for our Black youth. And so before we get started, I want to give you guys a little background on Alyssa. Yes, her last name is McIntyre, along with myself, Michael McIntyre. So you know this is my daughter. I'm proud of her, and she's a long-time resident, born and raised in Steubenville. Graduated from Steubenville High School, 10th in her class. Was a scholar. Top 10 of her class. She was a scholar. Also got a full ride scholarship to Ohio State University, where she graduated cum laude with 2 majors: women's gender sexuality, African and African American studies, also a minor in education.
Yes.
And so I want to congratulate you on your successful time at Ohio State. And now you're getting your master's in education, I believe.
Yes.
Master's in education. But what she was able to do is she decided to serve in the classroom, and she's become a teacher in Indianapolis while she's getting her master's. And she's in with our students in the classroom at a charter school called Vanguard Collegiate. Kind of a new school, successful school with students. They do a lot with our Black youth in the classroom. And so today we're going to find out what that's like for you. And so tell us a little bit about from going from Steubenville, Ohio to Indianapolis Vanguard Collegiate in the classroom on a Tuesday morning. What's the experience like for someone back in your situation?
So I think for me, something that the staff at Vanguard and myself talk a lot about is the fact that I've been spoiled in my first year of teaching. So me being at a predominantly Black school with predominantly Black staff and students, that's rare. Okay. Even in somewhere like Indianapolis, which is a big city, to have that experience is rare. So I think that it has been a great experience for me. It's been an empowering experience for me. I think that me being younger and thinking about or envisioning myself as a teacher, I would think of me now. So I think that this experience for me has been fulfilling, but it's also been a lot of time for self-reflection and helped me think about what I want to do in the future, which has recently changed. Just me having this experience as a Black teacher with predominantly Black staff and staff on the same page when it comes to educating Black youth, and then also being in front of Black youth every single day.
Let me ask you, when you say they said you're spoiled because of this the situation you're in, like you said, being all Black staff, Black teachers, and majority Black youth in the classroom. Can you tell me from someone on the outside looking into what you just said, to knowing what I've been through in my school system, knowing that what you've been through to some extent when you grew up in school. Mm-hmm. If we were sitting in those same seats, what is the biggest? Is there a big difference in what those kids are getting than what you and some other kids, white kids, got in your home town of Steubenville, Ohio?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing, I would say, me as a black student, being at home where all of the teachers, or the majority of the teachers I had, were white. I think that the experience for them is, one, you have the, I guess, experience, some of the experiences that I have, or just the black culture in general, some of the things you just know, gives you that common ground with the students. Going into teaching, I was thinking that me being a black teacher, me having something in common, or being able to in some way or in some ways relate to the students. And some people would say, no, you have to watch. You may go in, you may have some type of commonalities with them, but you may not, because you don't know where they come from, and it could be totally different. And I think that in some cases, how I grew up is totally different than my students, but there's just certain things that I can connect on with my students that I was never able to when I was younger. So for example, just me being able to talk, especially with the black girls at my school, about my hair.
Right.
A lot of them, me just coming in there and having my braids and my braids looking like them, and me going in there and then just seeing me, they got excited, and I was excited to see them. So things like that I've never experienced, those are truly things that are groundbreaking. It may seem like small things, but those are groundbreaking things that like starts that relationship building with your students.
I see. So then basically you feel that one of the differences would then be when you were a third grader, fourth grader in the Steubenville City school system, you never had that feeling. There was never a time a teacher came in and her hair was anything like yours. Or like your mother's.
Right.
Even though your mother had good hair.
What is good hair?
Well, what is good hair? Another conversation in the black community we could have. But anyway, but my point is, I'm saying that in quotes, meaning that's what is said. But I never really thought about that. But that's something that I've always wanted to get more black teachers in the school system in our area. And that was part of the reason I said, hey, we need role models. And our kids need to be able to look up to someone, but not necessarily look up to them in a matter of authority, just commonality. Just, I see you in me. I see me in you. And that's a very good point that you made there. One more thing I want to talk about in the classroom right now before we get into some other issues is that you being from the school system that you're from and looking at your school system that you work in, is it much different? Meaning the generality, day-to-day things, grading scales, the attention to detail, I don't know, per student time with teacher. Anything like that. Is that a big difference that you've noticed?
Yes. So I think that, yes, there's a big difference when it comes to, when you said that teacher-student ratio.
Yes.
So at the school I teach at, none of the classes that I teach, or none of the classes are above 20 students. Okay. So it's always that 1 to under 20 student ratio with a teacher. The class that I was in just thinking of high school, I think there were like probably at least 30 students in the classroom, which I think that if there is any more than 20 students in a classroom and there's only one teacher, there is no way that the kids, or the majority of the kids in the classroom, are getting the education that they need, because it's just not possible for a teacher to be and to give each student that individualized help that they need with that many students. So just that right there, I think another key difference for me, just for my experiences, I'm just at a much smaller school. So therefore, some of the things or that I feel like happened or happens in bigger schools just doesn't happen at our school. So I think that like we have our suspension rate is way low. I think a lot of that goes into just how our behavior system works at our school, but also the fact that we are a small school. So I think that's different as well. I just think the community or the culture of the school is much different. I feel like our culture at the schools growing up was just, yes, it was Big Red, but it was a more pride in not being from Big Red. Just like as a school, it was more of for sports.
Yeah.
So you were proud because it was sports related. It wasn't necessarily you're proud of the school you're in, the education that you're getting. I feel like they're having more strides in when it comes to education now in the STEM school, but it was more of sports based.
Yeah, I agree with that, and because that was always something that I always felt was underrated about the school system. I thought our school system had a great education. What I did realize is when I say that, I do want to make sure now when I say it that I say they're higher learning programs, meaning
That's what I was going to say.
The Scholars program that you and your brother was in, and a lot of the kids that I know that have been in that, I know that that's an awesome program. That's a good education. But I don't necessarily know that trickles down amongst everybody else, and we can talk about that as we go along. So let me hit you with some questions that I always call hard questions for the average person. And again, I just like to get your input, not necessarily that this is a Vanguard position that you're taking. This is just you as a private person and a teacher. I want to get your opinion on this question here. If you can, what is one thing that you believe should be changed or corrected that could be a game changer in Black education in America?
So I think that's a very complex question.
Okay.
I don't think that there's one thing that can be a game changer. I think that there's multiple things. I think that you can look at it from many different directions. So one could say just curriculum and how the curriculum that is in place at most schools don't necessarily value or take into account Black kids' experiences. Which ends up resulting in them performing poorly with that curriculum. I think you can say the lack of Black teachers in certain places as well. I think that you can look at it as the lack of Black people in positions of power when it comes to not only being a principal of a school, because I think that it's one thing to be a principal of a school and have power within that context, but there's also state standards. So it doesn't matter if it is a charter school or a public school, or if it is a Black principal or a white principal or any principal of color, you still have state standards that you have to cover, which I definitely don't think take into account Black kids' experiences. I think they're very biased. When people talk about standardized testing, they also we also should be thinking about the state standards that all schools have to adhere to. So I think you can look at it at that end as well. So I think there's a lot of things that needs to be changed for Black youth.
Let me ask you this then. What would be, if you could only start with one thing, but what I tell you is that once you come up with this one thing, I'm going to totally fund that, or I'm going to totally allow you to create the way that it's done. We'll break it down.
Okay.
Let's start with the actual curriculum, the subjects that is taught in elementary. Let's start with elementary school. We're going to change elementary school K through 6. It's K through 5.
Okay.
Throughout America, you're Secretary of Education. All of a sudden, you've been chosen, and the president comes to you and says, "I'm going to give you an unlimited budget to change one thing in our curriculum." What would you do if you had to do something?
I would make sure that reading, which I was just watching a video with you and a lady said this, that reading is taught past the 2nd or 3rd grade. It is not. So I think that before students can leave elementary school to go into middle school, they have to be able to know how to read. And I mean read more than sight words. So like words like as, of, the, she, more than that. Because once you if you do not know how to read, once you get to teaching things that's content related,
Mhm.
anything else,
Mhm.
if you can't read, there's no way you can get those other things. That happens in middle school, and there's no way to do things like improve test scores or anything like that, increase the rigor in your curriculum if students can't read. And they can't when they get to middle school. A lot of times, or the majority of the students I have, they're not reading at grade level or
Okay.
anywhere close. So I think that's one thing
So
I
let's,
feel like I would change.
okay. So reading, literacy.
Yes, so reading.
Okay, so reading literacy, you hear the word fluency, reading fluency, things of that nature. So let's say, so Secretary McIntyre would start there with this unlimited amount of money for this program.
Right.
And your goal at the end of that is that you would be feeling, because you only had to choose one, you chose one that can hit almost every, because through reading comprehension, a child's mind can take advantage of the rest of the education a little bit better. So now let's unpack reading. What are some things you put money towards, or what are some of the ways that you would increase? I heard you say something about sight words. What is that?
So sight words are, as I said, things like as, of, the. So those small
Okay, I see.
words, as opposed to bigger words. So just the basic words.
Okay.
Okay. Some of the things you said, what?
What you would do to increase this reading, to make these children read better, where would you spend that money? Would it be more teachers? Would it be, more hours of reading in the classroom? What's the ways that you would, what would you do as Secretary of State? You'd be changing, you'd have an influence on all public schools, basically, so.
Right. So I think more focus in reading, absolutely.
Okay.
I think making sure that the books or whatever the children are reading are things that they can relate to.
Okay.
So a lot of times kids don't want to read because it's things that's just not important to them, or they don't feel that it's interesting to them.
Okay.
So why would you want to read something that's not interesting to you?
So more familiar content.
Right.
Okay.
And just getting, I think just having that just positive culture around reading in general. So like I know a lot of schools and a lot of districts just have a big emphasis on reading. So they may have like a whole, day or celebration for reading. So just celebrating reading and not making it or seem like it's just something negative or making, or kids often think it's just something that is boring.
So under a Secretary McIntyre term or tenure of as a Secretary of Education, would something like a child cannot be put in the second grade until they're reading on a second grade level?
Yes.
Can't get out of second grade until they're reading on a third grade level?
Right.
And that would be part of a pass-fail type thing. You either can or you can't. It doesn't matter what you got in math, doesn't matter what you got in. Would that be something that you would see that would be beneficial?
Yes, but I also think that the tests that are created to judge that, because it's already supposed to be like that. There's already supposed to be tests that say you're not supposed to go to this grade level until you pass this, or until you can read on this certain level. So there's already supposed to be tests that are like that. So I think the problem is those tests need to be changed, because there's already tests like that. There's already state tests, standardized tests that students already take. That is supposed to say, okay, this student is able to go to the next level.
So this surprised you. If I told you that I'd read a statistic that it said that 60% of the black youth, once they get in middle school, don't read at a middle school level. That wouldn't surprise you. So what I'm trying to figure out is, I got a disconnect between, did they pass that test that you said that they're supposed to have taken?
No.
So then how did they get there if they have to pass that test first?
So depending on the state. So I know here they may take those state tests.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that they can't go to the next grade. The school decides on whether they can. So say that they didn't pass this test and this test, the school may decide, okay, well, they did well in reading, they got a C in reading, or they didn't fail in reading, so therefore we can push them along to the next grade. Now, some schools, they do have policies of where if they didn't pass this state test, then they won't move them along. But other schools do not. They can still pass them along.
I see. Okay, we're going to come back to your administration as Secretary of Education, because that's very interesting in some of the things that you'd said there that I didn't even really understand. Let me ask you this question. I'm going to ask you the question, and then I'm going to qualify it before you answer it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think, or do you believe if the black community was unified or together, it would be easy to eliminate the achievement gap? And let me qualify that in a little different way now that you've made some of the statements you made. I want to add to this, if the black students had more support, if the black community was behind them, because I don't know if we as a community can all come together. But what I do want to focus on is that if the whole black community can come together behind their kids.
Okay.
Because now it doesn't matter what religion you are, because I'm supporting my kid. So if my kid comes to this public school district, it's not about religion. It's about helping them, as you said, reach that reading level in order to get by. But if we all came together to support the kids, and I know that seems like a no-brainer, but what I want you to do is tell me why, if you believe that's true, why.
Why, if we all came together to support
the youth, the black youth, we could eliminate the achievement gap.
Yes.
You do believe that?
Right. I do think that that could happen. Now, how we would eliminate that achievement gap, I think my view on it is a little different than most. But I think that if we all were in support of, that we want black youth to be educated or have a quality education, then yes, I think that we could come together. But that process on how to do it, I feel like my view on it is different than what you normally hear or what most.
Okay, well, we're going to go to that different dimension again, that dimension where you are the Secretary of Education.
Okay.
And now you have a whole black community that's going to support their children in what you say should be done. What some ways would you start that? Now, we know the reading. What other things would you say? Hey, listen, community, this is what our kids need. What would you be telling the black community about what the kids need in the classroom?
Okay. So for me, when I think of the achievement gap and people saying we need to close the achievement gap, I think that we often think that the reason why there is that gap is poor or failing schools, or not having qualified teachers in the classroom. You hear things like kids not reading on certain grade levels. You hear maybe lack of parent involvement in the child's education.
Yes.
You hear all of those things that contribute to that achievement gap. But I feel like what we don't hear is the fact that this gap that was created, or this gap, or the dimension or the universe that this gap is within, is on a system that is inherently racist. So we don't look at the fact that this gap was already created before I feel like black people even had that chance to be educated. So if we're looking historically, for hundreds of years, black people it was illegal for them to be educated.
Yes.
So therefore, when this system of education or traditional schooling was built, it wasn't thinking, or black people or black children weren't in that framework. So it's hard to try to do all of these things or put these bandages on this big wound when it comes to the achievement gap, when we need to look at what are we trying to actually fix, or what gap are we trying to close here. So I don't think that doing those things will necessarily get us where we need to be. I think that we need to start really thinking of just eliminating the system that we have when it comes to schooling.
Yes. Period.
As a whole.
Let me say this, and to our viewers also, a lot of times what happens with my interviews, it's really a conversation. And it's a conversation in Black America, because what I want to try to get our listeners to understand, and all of us to realize, is that, for instance, you have some people running for the United States, President of the United States right now, and they're running around and they are trying to get our vote. They're trying to get your vote. And right now, you are the most important thing to them. After the election's over, they go back in a room and they decide things and they don't think of us.
Right.
But we are important.
Mm-hmm.
And if we understand what's going on, we can make a difference. And so I want them to understand that, like when you made the statement about the sight words, when you talk about this achievement gap and what dimension it's in, because that's a good definition or a way to put that. Because most people hear achievement gap and all they can think of is black kids here, white kids here.
Right.
What does that actually mean? Because when you said, what are we trying to actually close when it comes to that? And I think what we're trying to close is the success rate. We want our kids to be successful. We want them to be able to get jobs like white kids. We want them to be able to go to college like white kids. We want them to be able to start their own businesses like black kids. We want them to be able to get business loans. We want them to be able to do everything that America has promised every citizen, which we are, to have. And because the way our system is set up in America, there is a lot of things that's set up on a system of education. You get paid more for a degree, not degree. You get paid more for this type of degree, or you get paid if you take, to get a job, you got to pass this test that you have to read in order to take, and you have to understand. Therefore, the reason why we measure the achievement gap is basically a measurement of how well you would be able to succeed in the system that's out there, in my opinion. So therefore, it's not just a statistic, it's saying our kids need to be able to go get a job, sit down for an interview, and be able to do the thing they need to get that interview. So again, we're just having a conversation. We're trying to unpack some things, and we want to get to some solutions. That's why I take you into that realm and say you're Secretary of State. Just like to hear some things that other people might listen and say, you know what, reading is important. I'm going to start having my kid read every day.
Yes.
I'm going to buy a book for my kid to read. And the biggest thing I want to tell everyone out there is that if you would decide to do something like that with your kids and reading, having them read out loud to you or to somebody, or when they're reading, period, even if nobody's listening, reading out loud I believe, is very good.
Yeah.
When you hear yourself read, you can already sometimes know if you sound like you should sound. When you read to yourself, a lot of times, at least me, you skip over stuff. You're just reading fast. And so that's a tip from me anyway. With not a teacher, but a substitute teacher anyway. So let me get you some other questions I want to ask you before because I know your time is limited and valuable. So let me ask you this question. There was an interesting thing I seen, and I know you don't necessarily have an opinion that you want to necessarily expound on, but I was in the NAACP, as you know. I was a president and vice president for several years in the NAACP, and one of the biggest things we had was charter school, public school. And what I wanted to know is, what's your view of that? Is that an either or is that a both and to you?
Right. So after hearing people on both sides, interacting with people on both sides, especially like within these past 2 years or a year and a half in Indianapolis, I think that I can understand both sides, and I think that both sides mean well and want to, at the end of the day, educate Black youth. But I think we can have both. And I also think that for me, I'm not a either or side, because I think the bigger, I don't think we should necessarily be having the debate on whether public schools are better or charter schools are better. I think that we need to actually be having a conversation on how can public schools and how can charter schools both be schools that serve Black children. Right. So how can public schools be better schools for Black children or children of color, and how can public schools as well be better schools for children of color? So I don't know necessarily which, if it's productive to have the conversation on which one is better, but I feel like we need to have a conversation on how can we make sure that either or they are good fits for children.
And I'm going to let you I'm gonna let you skate on that question because I like your answer basically from where you sit is I think that was an awesome answer because you're answering from in the classroom and that's where you do your business. That's your expertise. That's who you care about. You care about what's going on in that classroom and those kids in that classroom.
Right.
Because as you explained your answer, the discussion is different outside of the classroom because it's people are fighting over money. That's really what it's about. You got people fighting over money because when I was in the NAACP, the only reason why the NAACP, from my standpoint and from what I would hear and understand why they were against charter schools, was because the money is taken away from public schools. So therefore, it wasn't about, like you said, well, is the kids not learning in the charter school? Are the kids happy in the charter school? Well, does it matter if they're in there? Or are they still, what does that matter? That was never the argument. Yeah. Now, on the charter side, when I've heard people discuss the charter side, it's all about kids are performing better in charter schools. Therefore, it's a no-brainer that we should have charter schools. And most people would think that because they would think, oh, well, children are learning or they're doing better. Then it's a no-brainer. But what the NAACP then would say is, you might be right. The problem is you can't educate all kids in charter schools because there's not enough of those schools.
Right.
And so there lies the argument. And so the NAACP is that it was a misnomer in the Bush administration of no child left behind. Because there are children left behind in those systems other than the public school system. The public school system was designed for every kid to have a classroom and every kid to have an education. And being in Black history, we know that there was something wrong with that inherently. But we're going to move on from that question and finish up. We're going to ask one more question and we're going to take a break for our first segment and then we'll come back and finish our questions on the second segment. Okay. Last one. I want to end here is how big of an effect is the child's outside of school environment have on his success in the classroom?
I think it is.
Give me a percentage if you had to say it of what that does to the ultimate success.
I don't know. I would say, I don't know if I could say a percent. I would say it is one of the biggest effects.
Okay, if there's only two effects, what goes on in the classroom and what goes on out of the classroom, is it 50-50 or is it 55-45?
I would say it was 55. I would say it is 55-45.
In what favor?
As in the school or the outside environment than what happens in the school.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Break that down for me. Tell us a little bit about what you have seen, in our kids, and in how their outside effect affects them in the classroom.
Absolutely. So, this is something or a question I've had to grapple with and think about, with me being a teacher, for the past year and a half. So, just a little story. So a lot of my students, they go through lots and lots of things outside of the school that I couldn't, or me and you wouldn't even think of prior to me being a teacher, that I couldn't even imagine before. And it may have happened to them in the past, or they may go through things that are happening at the time that they're in school, like as in the night before or the day before or over break before coming to school. So I often have to grapple with them coming into my classroom and me having this, which I wanted to bring this book up. It's a book by Bettina Love, and it's called We Want to Do More Than Survive. And it talks about abolitionist teaching practices and just this pursuit for educational freedom. And it talks about how teachers of color are often in this, I think she calls it an educational survival complex, and where we try to teach students things like grit. So if you do fail something, don't give up. You need to still keep going, or teach them how to take standardized tests and teach them all these things to basically help them get ahead. And I go every day and I feel like that is what majority of what I'm teaching them. I have them come into the classroom and I expect them to listen to what I'm saying and at times be silent and be fully engaged in me talking about the American Revolution and me teaching them and expect them to master this standard that I have to teach them. But meanwhile, they just, if the night before, went through something so traumatic. How can I expect them to sit in a classroom after and do those things after that has happened to them?
Yes.
So I think that is why I feel like it's more so an effect on the students. So now there's been a big push recently, which I have been trying to transform my classroom and our school has. It's something called trauma-informed teaching or trauma-informed practices or trauma-informed classroom. You're here where basically your classroom or your teaching style takes into account the trauma that students have or have had in the past, and how does that affect them when coming to school. So it may be things like making sure that your classroom is a safe environment. So having as much as possible, creating a classroom environment where students don't have to be scared to be in the classroom. Because there's many schools where you could go to school, and my kids have said schools they've been to before, and they've been on lockdown multiple times because of fights or people bringing things into the school. So how can you create a school or a classroom where they feel safe, or things like giving them positive reinforcement, or taking into account they may not have gotten this paper done because last night something may have happened. Right. So how can you bend your whatever your system is because of that, because you're taking that into account. And also just giving them things like consistency that they may not have at home or in their environments outside of school. So with all that being said, I think it has a huge effect, but I think that it's just something. It doesn't mean that students who do experience trauma can't learn or can't be successful. I think it's, in order for them to be successful, teachers and schools need to take those things into account and not have just some solid, rigid system of educating them because these things happen. And I feel like that is the reason why the system of education that we have, or this traditional schooling, why that's never going to benefit children of color, because it hasn't taken that into account. So
no, you made it crystal clear to me. I will be having discussions on all of the videos that we do. We will have, I will unpack some of the videos we do at a later time. I'll put them online. You'll be able to see them, and we'll talk about them. And let me just tell you where I went to when you started talking about that. You mentioned that at one time in America it was against the law for blacks to read. And then what you described about the things that you, in the last year and a half, that you had to understand that what kids can come to school and try to learn with what had happened at home. And what I think about is, I don't know you being young, but those of our audience members, if you would just put in your mind, think about the different movies that you've seen about slavery, or documentaries that you've talked about slavery, the beatings, the rape, the constant all-day work, the being scared, the diseases, the malnutrition. Just think if the kids that were in slavery had to get up every day and go to school and still be a slave child, how well would they have learned? Because they would have went through hell the night before, the morning of, when they get home, what they're waiting for. And that's what I thought about. You wouldn't ask somebody to learn in that type of environment. What I also thought about is when we discussed that gap. Because in the big house, little Sally don't have to deal with none of that. When she gets up and go to work the next morning, she's well fed, she just had breakfast, she slept comfortably, she wasn't afraid, she did her homework, she's up and ready to go, and her hair's all done and her clothes are new and fresh, and she's taking a shower. And then she sits in a class, and there's a teacher who looks just like her, that's also had a bath and had all these things and eaten well and did all those things. Right. And I sit and look, and you test this child and you test that child, and you think the result is supposed to be the same.
Right.
It's unimaginable that we can be such intelligent people and assume that that's what's going to happen.
Right.
And so,
and it also makes me think of, like, when thinking of that achievement gap, which is also another way that I think, when I think about the achievement gap, why I don't necessarily think that fixing small things like changing reading programs and things like that, those small, I feel like, bandages, is because when you were explaining that, it made me think of, yes, all of those things that they go through, how can you expect them to come in and do those things? But we also need to look at all of those, why are all of those things happening?
Yes.
And a lot of it is the areas they live in, and the fact that they live in poor areas, or that their parents can't get ahead because of all of the other things going on, and just all the other systems, and just systemic racism in itself. So we also, which is why I said we need to look at the fact that just the system is racist.
Yes.
So therefore, we can't talk about these other things or closing these gaps if we don't look at the outside things that affect it, that has nothing to necessarily do with the classroom.
Yes. And again, so we're going to finish there,
Mm-hmm.
and we come back, we'll pick up there a little bit and go on to finish our questions. And I know you got to go, but we're going to have two-part to this interview.
Okay.
And if you be patient, we'll be right back. Be right back with you in a minute with Alyssa McIntyre. We're back here with peace, knowledge, and wisdom. This is a channel that we've created so that we can see the Black experience in America through the eyes of a lot of different people throughout America, but mainly in our local Ohio Valley. And today we're going to get our second part of our interview with Miss Alyssa McIntyre, who's a teacher in the Indianapolis School District, born and raised in Steubenville, Ohio, graduate of Steubenville Big Red, and now she is serving the youth of Indianapolis. Some of the things we've been over already that you've heard us talk about, I want to go over some of the things we delved into a little bit anyway about the effect the outside of the classroom has on the youth as they endeavor to get their education. And one of the things that Miss McIntyre basically right on the nail gave us an experience to understand that there's a lot of our inner city youth, a lot of our Black youth that go into the classroom having experienced what some might determine as hell outside of the classroom. The inner cities, what some people quote unquote call ghettos. You have gang violence, you have domestic violence, you have issues in the home, you have economic problems that our kids that the kids' parents have to face. You have traumas, and PTSD is something that is not really talked about a lot with our youth, of some of the things that they experience on the streets in some of the inner cities. And so when she started talking about the outside of the home and some of the things the kids went through, I just imagined of how well they could possibly be prepared every single morning early, getting up and trying to perform at their best to succeed and close this achievement gap that we talk about. We also talked about at least a little bit about if the Black community could be unified or together, how much that would be in support of our Black youth, what more could be done in their reaching their success. So now what we're going to do is we're going to park on another question I want to get your answer on. Dr. Howard Fuller of Marquette University, he made a statement when he was asked a question about what can be done to help our Black youth in the achievement gap, what's some of the things that's needed. And he came back with an interesting statement. I want to see what you think of this. He said, the fundamental problem is people don't care about our children. Our children are not a priority. Do you disagree with that? And if so, why?
I don't disagree. I feel like I agree with that to an extent. I think that if you are thinking about curriculum, if you're thinking about textbooks and how schools have been built over the years, I think that, yes, you would agree that our children or children of color were not a priority. You can see that through, like I said, things like textbooks and curriculum. Their experiences are not shown throughout that. However, I think why I say to an extent is because I think that it depends on the context or where you're at. So I think that when you are in areas or if you're within schools where it is predominantly people of color or maybe even allies of people of color. I think that, yes, children of color are the priority. So me coming from a school right now where the school was built and the vision was for Black children being the priority, I think that, yes. However, overall, if you're looking at it on a bigger scale, the United States or America, no, they have not been a priority. And I think that that is definitely, just looking at it systematically, that is a big problem within education.
And I believe, I looked at it originally, that's how I looked at it. When he said it, it rang so true to me. Because I seen this, he was on a panel, Dr. Fuller was, and the question had been asked about our youth, and somebody said, well, doing this with our youth, and if we do that with our youth, and if we had funding for this for our youth, and this is what people were talking about. Yeah. And so then when he got his turn, he abruptly said, people do a lot of talk about the youth. People do a lot of talk about the kids. We got to do it for the kids. But ultimately, when you look at our state budgets, our city budgets, our national budgets, and when you look at how much money is focused on our kids, and especially Black kids, it'll show you what the priorities are. And Black kids, how much resources and money and funds is sent their way would show you they're not cared about at all. And if that's the case, it's sad. It's a sad predicament that we are fighting through.
Right.
So let me go to the next question here. I want you to give me your thoughts on this. Explain to me what an investment and intervention means to you. And also, I want you to also tackle a little bit about this. Mr. Fuller made a statement also. He said there's some fully credentialed teachers he wouldn't want teaching his kids. So on those two things, give me your feeling on those things. First of all, what an investment and intervention means. I heard him talk about that in this educational platform.
So for me, when I think of a investment in intervention, the first thing that came to mind is a system that is often used in schools and in the school system. It's called RTI, so it's response to intervention. So basically it is a system that is made to respond to once students are assessed, or once you first get your students in the classroom, you're able to assess them to see what gaps that they may have. So it may be in reading, it may be in vocabulary. So what are those maybe smaller or bigger gaps that they have, and teachers or schools should be able to make a plan to assess or to, help those specific gaps before giving them a test at the end of the year. So how can we intervene and address these things before it's too late, or rather than later? So things like a plan for, say a student does struggle with reading. So maybe some type of plan where you pull them for small group reading, or maybe one-on-one reading where you're working with them on their reading, and then seeing how this has helped. So that intervention, how has that helped them over time?
So an investment in that would mean what?
So an investment, to me, I think an investment would be for a school to actually have a plan or an RTI system put in place.
I see.
So to have that, or a teacher within their classroom to actually have that in place. And I think that the investment comes in, I think, on a bigger scale, because oftentimes schools may have or say they have this RTI system, but it's not really used.
Okay.
So for me, when I think of having it or it being an investment, it means to actually put in the funds, the teachers, or the aides, or teachers' help, or teachers' aides, or any type of intervention specialist within that classroom to make sure that there is that within the classroom, because some classrooms do not have that, or most classrooms don't have that. So an investment in that would be to put the funds or just the time, or to actually map out a solid system for that program or for intervention.
So earlier we talked, and we made up a time and hypothetical when you would be Secretary of Education. And one of the things you said, if you had to choose one area that you would put a lot of money to, and it would be unlimited budget for you to fund this area to improve the Black youth's success. You talked about reading. Would intervention be one of those things you could see putting money to?
Absolutely. I think that any type of intervention system is one of the most beneficial things that you can do in a classroom. So oftentimes, one of my biggest things I like to do in my classroom is something called aggressive monitoring. So basically where as the students are working on whatever independent practice activity that I have them doing, once I already have taught the lesson, then I'll go around to them and as they're working on that, say, hey, you may want to fix this, or good job at this, or to basically fix while they're working, fix the problem, then rather later on they have something like an exit ticket, which is basically like a mini quiz to assess what they learned. Did you actually meet this goal? Did you actually master this standard? So for me to be able to go at that time in real time as they're doing it and fix it then, as opposed to later getting them their exit ticket and saying, man, they got a 0 on this exit ticket. So now you have this 0 in the grade book when you probably wouldn't have had that 0 in the grade book if you would have fixed it while they were trying to figure it out.
So they could understand exactly where they're
right at that moment, as opposed to performing bad or not as well on it later on. So those type of intervention techniques or strategies, I feel like is most helpful because it allows for you to not have those bad test scores or those poor performances on things like exit tickets, quizzes, because you're intervening before they get to actually do this.
Let me ask you: is that a per teacher? The way you see it now, is that a per teacher investment, or is that a school system investment? Is that a curriculum investment? Is that a change in the standard of how America teaches? How do you see that? Meaning, first of all, in two parts. If you were Secretary of Education, how would you see that being? And how does it work now for you in the classroom? Is that something that you personally do? Is that a Vanguard thing? Is that a Mr. Love or a Mr. Marshall thing?
Okay. So usually that is a school thing. Okay. So that is a system that the school should have, so that all of the teachers are doing it. Okay, so it's not necessarily like, it may end up being something where some teachers are doing it and some teachers aren't. However, it should be something that is mandated by the school. It should be some certain system that the school, a unified system that the school has.
I see.
And then the teachers actually apply that based on, depending on the students that they have. It is not just something that could be, that is something that is just academic. It could be intervention when it comes to behavior, things like that. So it is not just something that is purely academic, but that is something that ends up being affected, or those are some of the techniques that teachers often use. So yes, it is something school-wide.
And so then if you were, if you were the Secretary of State of Education, you had an unlimited budget, that's something you'd be doing. That's an area that you would add. As far as teachers, you would add intervention aides, so to speak.
Right, intervention specialist. Yeah,
specialists, intervention specialists. So then that leads us into the second part of the question I wanted to ask. When I said that Mr. Fuller made a statement that there's some fully credentialed teachers that I wouldn't want teaching my classroom.
Right.
Why would he make a statement like that? That sounds like he's saying that you don't have to be fully credentialed to be in a classroom.
Right.
Okay.
So what I think that he's getting at, and why I totally agree. So it's one thing for a teacher to be fully certified. So as in take these certification tests by the state that, in my opinion, are not necessarily the the end all be all to determine whether somebody should or should not be a teacher. But once they take those tests or go through that schooling to become fully certified, it's one thing to be able to have these different teaching strategies, or to be able to develop this certain type of curriculum that may or may not be great. But it's another thing to be able to actually teach. In my case, I'm thinking of it as children of color. So you may be able to do these things when it comes to teaching, but if you don't have those relationships with students, if you don't know how to build a relationship with certain students, then therefore this curriculum or these teaching strategies mean nothing, because you won't be able to even get to that if you don't have that relationship first with the student. So he's thinking of teachers who have no idea on how to interact or build a relationship with students of color, and not take into account, like I was talking about earlier, their experiences, but then come in and expect to do all of these different fancy strategies or have this rigorous curriculum that really means nothing if you can't, I guess, break through that surface at the beginning.
Yes. And I want to comment that it stuck with me when you talked about some of the issues that children have outside of the home, and how it's unfair that there's not more of an investment in intervention, because every statistic says we need it. You can go down to the sheriff's office in any county. You can go to the police department in any city. You can go to the social services building in any city, any town, any state, and talk about the issues that we have in our country. And these issues, whether it's incarceration, whether it's the drug epidemic, opioids, and things of these natures, whether it's gun matters, whether it's gang violence, whether it's violence against women, whether it's predator sexual predators. All these things, you can hear all these statistics. This happens so often. This happens here. This happens there. But there's an effect. There's people who that affects. Right. And so if it's happening in one community more, then the children of that community are going to need a little more.
Right.
So for instance, I'm sure you guys have had this situation, or you've seen this, a lot of you out there, where there may be a death in a school. And all of a sudden you hear that the school took a day and they had these grief counselors come in. But that can happen to some kids, and nothing happens. There's no grief counselors at the school to meet them when there's somebody happened to their sister, brother, cousin, friend in the neighborhood, where they were all night scared, locked down because somebody's going through. And then the next morning they got a test to take.
Right.
And Miss McIntyre may not care what happened to them. All she knows is, get your pencil out, take your books off the desk, do your test, I'm going to grade it.
Right.
And when that person gets an F, they get an F in the book, and nothing happens about that. Now, what you've told us is that doesn't necessarily happen in Miss McIntyre's class, because you do have to struggle with making sure that you understand that you have a relationship with these kids. Now, do you feel that a situation like that in your classroom is something you would hear about? Do you have a relationship with the kids that they would probably tell you about that?
Yes. I think that, yes, I have a relationship with kids that they would, but I also feel like, which is why, another reason why I like being at the school I'm at, the school, all of the children have a great relationship with the school. We do have a counselor on staff, and we do have an administration team who tries to know what is going on, or does everything they can to know what is going on the outside, and communicates with the parents and families to know what is going on that side, so that we all know that. So if I don't hear it from the kids, then I'm hearing it from administration, so that we do know that when going into the classroom. So I think that knowing that beforehand definitely does help the teacher, but as well as help the student. So.
Okay. Now that we've gotten through some of the questions I want to ask you, I want to go in a little last couple, I'll call them short answer questions. That you just fire me some answers I'm going to ask. Right now, as far as your kids go, do you do a lot in your school system? Do you do anything with current events with the kids? Do they know? They seem like they're aware of things that's going on. Do they know anything about the Trump impeachment trial?
Yes.
They do know about
So it's more so a lot of times if there's something else within. So since I do teach social studies, a lot of times it works out where I am able to, the topic that we are on, pull some of the current events that are going on within into that. So example from my U.S. history class with 8th graders, we talk a lot about government, things like that. So to be able to pull in some of the current events that are going on now into that, and then also making that connection of look what's happening now, the current events that's happening now, and look at what we're learning about what happened in the past. You'll see why some of these things are happening because you're seeing who built these systems, how these systems were built, who was in the back of those founding fathers, things like that, mind when making the systems. So now they're able to make those connections.
So a little connected knowledge that happens.
Right.
Okay. Next question. That was a good answer for that one. Next question would be, it's Black History Month. 2 questions. First question is, off the top of your head, favorite person in Black history for you?
Ella Baker.
Ella Baker.
Yes.
Okay, give me a little background on Ella Baker.
So Ella Baker was a civil rights activist, human rights activist who started out in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with Dr. King and some of those other major civil rights leaders, and then left because she felt as though her voice wasn't being heard as much as she felt like it should have. So she wanted to do something different. So she helped form the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee, SNCC.
Oh, okay, yes.
Yes. So why I love Ella Baker so much is she didn't want to go and start her own branch or organization within the civil rights movement. Instead, she said she's seen that the youth were powerful. She felt that the youth could have an even bigger push. She felt like there was a change happening from the civil rights movement into more of the youth having a voice or power. So what she did was she said, instead of me being the leader of this, I'm going to go find youth and be more of a facilitator, help them become the leaders or teach them these skills for them to be the leaders and for them to start their own initiative or push. Okay. So that's a lot of where my vision as a teacher in the classroom comes from, is from her, me being more of a facilitator. So how can I empower my students in order for them to be leaders rather than me being the leader? How can I empower them so that they are the leaders instead of me?
Good deal. Ella Baker. I'm going to do a lot more research on her too. You know, I've heard of her and I knew about SNCC. Yeah. But I didn't understand that was her, the reason behind her, getting involved and starting that. At Vanguard, what's that mean? What's Black History Month mean to them? What's going on in the halls as it relates to Black history? Anything?
Yes. So what we do at Vanguard is we have put together, I would like to say the students as well as staff have put together a Black History Museum. So it's the Vanguard Black History Museum where, last year was our first year. Of course, we're a first year school. So the last year was our first year where students created different projects. So we had anything from, depending on what they wanted to do, it could be anywhere from like a video. So like a lot of our kids are into YouTube. That's the new thing. So YouTube video, there were different things like trifold boards, artwork, paintings, those different things where students would put those things together, and we opened up the gym and we opened it up to the school, to community members and family members, where they would come in and view all of the kids' projects. And I wanted for each grade to do a different time period in Black history. So starting with the 7th graders focused on ancient African civilizations. So Africa before colonization, before the transatlantic slave trade. And then the 6th grade focuses on the civil rights and Black Power movement. And then the 5th graders worked on more modern Black history. So the Colin Kaepernick, Black Lives Matter,
okay.
Obama's presidency, those more current topics. I'm really excited this year because we now have 8th grade. So I was trying to think of what should I have my 8th graders do. I don't know if I want to go more of a time period. I feel like I've covered them. So 8th graders are going to do Black activism and the different methods of protest that Black people have done over time, anywhere from sit-ins to boycotting different things, to marches, to kneeling. So all of the ways in which Black people have used protest or have displayed their activism, they're going to do that no matter what time period.
Great. Okay, I want to thank you for the time that you spent with me, and I'm hoping that I can get you back again because you have a wealth of knowledge that I think our people would want to hear and a perspective that we don't always get. And again, this channel, the Peace, Knowledge, and Wisdom channel, is for everyone out there that has a view, everyone out there that has a circumstance, an experience, and an expertise in something to voice their opinion so we can have an actual conversation and try to reach some solutions. What has been happening to me lately is that the Black community seems to be very polarized behind people, whether it be famous people, whether it be situations. We seem to take a side rather than listen to a perspective and voice our own, but at least always know that we need to support each other. And so education is a very big one. I'm glad to have this conversation with you today. So again, I want you to make sure you hit our subscribe button, hit our like button, and hit that bell so that every time we post one of these videos, you're notified. And soon I will be having a back and forth open live chat to talk about some of the things that Miss McIntyre said, some of the things that came up, some of the topics. And we'll have back and forth discussion just to see where we're at. And I want to just thank you for being here today. Again.
Thank you for having me.
And we will see you again on the next Peace, Knowledge, and Wisdom. Peace.